This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
There's actually a definite moral shape to expressive individualism because it really thrives through transgression, and it really thrives through a denial of, sociologically, a denial or rejection of inherited values, theologically through a rejection of the moral shape, the ends, the demands that being made in the image of God places upon us.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well. Looking forward to a nice discussion with a mutual friend.
Yes, this is a delight to welcome Carl Trueman, who is professor of Biblical and Theological Studies at Grove City College and is ending a one-year fellowship as visiting fellow at the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government at the University of Notre Dame. He's written a number of books, and we want to talk about the latest one, which is entitled The Desecration of Man, How the Rejection of God Degrades Our Humanity. Carl, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to see you guys. I just wish I could be there in person. It's good to see you as always.
Yes, I know. It happens too infrequently, but it's good to at least have this conversation. I wanted to begin by, I really had two things just to open up with on this book. So the first is this. I wonder if you could set this book in the context of some of the books that you've recently written. So it is related to the themes that you cover in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and related to themes that you cover in Strange New World. It's not required that anyone have read those books in order to come to this book. It definitely stands on its own and picks up that ground. But could you sort of set it in the context of the broader study you've been doing over the last number of years and analysis you've been doing?
Yeah, good question. I think it's sort of emerged. I didn't set this out to do this consciously, but I guess if I were to sort of summarize my work of the last 10 years, I would say anthropology, the doctrine of man, the question of what it means to be human is really the question that lurks below the surface of Rise and Triumph and Strange New World and becomes much more explicit in Desecration of Man. Forgot the title of my own book for a second there.
Yeah.
Just shows getting old is cruel, man.
No one noticed.
So anthropology, why anthropology over the last decade?
Well, as anybody who's read Rise and Triumph or Strange New World will know, my initial interest was why is it that the younger generation think about issues of sexuality and gender in ways that are dramatically different to the way that the three of us would think about them. It's not that the younger generation are deliberately setting out to deny the Bible. It's that they're approaching the Bible with a different horizon of expectation, a different horizon of interpretation. And I wanted to explore the nature of that horizon, which I did in Rise and Triumph. And as I was working on the transgender question, it became clear to me that actually the question of sexuality and gender can't be isolated from much bigger questions. Most, obviously, what does it mean to be human? And then after I'd completed those two works, I became intrigued with the question of, is there an ethical tilt in this modern expressive individualism, which was the sort of the term I borrowed from Charles Taylor to encapsulate the normative Western understanding of what it means to be human? Is it that there's a definite moral shape there, or is it sort of on one level, was it kind of random that we've ended up where we have? And the answer I propose in this latest book is no, there's actually a definite moral shape to expressive individualism because it really thrives through transgression. And it really thrives through a denial of, sociologically, a denial or rejection of inherited values, theologically through a rejection of the moral shape, the ends, the demands that being made in the image of God places upon us.
Carl, is there a telos to this desecration? Is the desecration the telos, or I think this is that void people are feeling.
Yeah,
where does this take us? Where's the good landing spot for humans that this achieves?
Well, that's where I think we see the paradoxical nature of what's gone on. And since I've written the book, I've been reading some of the German philosopher Gunther Anders, who's not a Christian, but he has this term Promethean shame, where he tries to address the fact that our scientific achievements have not made us feel great. They've actually made us feel very small and insignificant. Only we have the power to engage in scientific experiments. Only we have the power to produce the A-bomb. That's his particular issue. But in producing the A-bomb, we've rendered our own existence entirely contingent. And I think that when you ask what the telos is, I think the intentional telos is we will be like God. It's the temptation to Eve. If you eat the fruit, God knows that you will be like him. You will be godlike. And that's the temptation. That's the telos we want. But if you look at the drama of Genesis 3, the immediate effect of eating the fruit and being like God is that they're ashamed. Adam and Eve hide from each other and they hide from God. And that, to use Anders' term, that Promethean shame kicks in. So I would say we live at a time when we are in awe of our incredible powers. But what is that doing to us? Think of artificial intelligence. Only we can produce robots. But now we're talking about, well, if we produce these robots, hey, they'll be so much better than us in every way that we will cease to be useful beings and should simply vanish. So the telos is that we should be like gods. The real telos is we reduce ourselves to nothing. And that, I think, explains some of the frenzy and the despair that encapsulates so much of our current moment.
Speak a little bit about some remarks you make here and there in the book about why disenchantment is not quite enough as an interpretive framework to understand what's going on. It's not just that we don't believe in God, the soul, and angels anymore. Something more than just disenchantment. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for the disenchantment thesis. I certainly think that it captures quite a lot of modern experience. And for any listeners unfamiliar with it, disenchantment is really a term. I think you'll find it in the late 18th, early 19th century in Friedrich Schiller, the German romantic philosopher. But it's really popularized by Max Weber, and it's Weber's way of trying to capture the experience of life and the world in an industrialized, bureaucratized society. That the world tends to be a less magical place. We tend to think of ourselves as less significant. We become, in the Middle Ages, the village blacksmith was a very important person. We had skills that were necessary. In the industrialized world, hey, machines produce horseshoes, and you press a button that drives the machine. You don't have skills anymore. You can be easily replaced with somebody else. So there's that feeling of loss of magic in the world and loss of personal significance. And to be fair to those who push the disenchantment thesis, there's a lot to be said for that. It captures a lot of truth. My problem with it is it doesn't capture everything that's significant about modernity. I don't deal with this in the book, but for example, it doesn't really capture the resurgence of spiritualities. If you read Tara Isabella Burton's work, you'd be very aware that, man, for a lot of people, the world is still kind of magical. We have a lot of choice relative to our magic now that they didn't have in the Middle Ages, but the world is still a kind of magical place for many people. My concern in this book is less with that than with the fact that disenchantment doesn't capture certain aspects of modern life. And the particular issue I look at early in the book, or I highlight early in the book, is the language surrounding something like abortion. 30 years ago, under round about the time of Bill Clinton as president, the language of pro-abortion advocates was that it should be safe, legal, and rare. I don't agree with that position. But it seems to me qualitatively different to the position today, when abortion is a basic human right. You can't really be a woman unless you have access to abortion. One wants to celebrate and shout one's abortions. The earlier language, safe, legal, and rare, represents a kind of resigned disillusionment, if I could put it that way. The world is not as it should be. Sometimes we have to do bad stuff to avoid worse stuff. And there's this kind of shoulder shrug. It's unfortunate, but when we reluctantly have to do it, let's make sure it's safe, let's make sure it's legal, and let's make sure we don't do it very often. Now, the celebration of abortion, there's something ecstatic, frenzied, gleeful about the destruction of life that abortion involves. And it's not just abortion. We can think about the way medically assisted suicide is celebrated, the way the elimination of people with Down syndrome via selective abortion is being celebrated as a marked improvement for humanity. So I wanted to get at the question of, where does this ecstasy come from? Disenchantment doesn't explain some of the ecstatic, destructive stuff that's going on.
How does abortion and euthanasia, just to take those sort of like two ends of the death obsession, how does that play into the thesis that man is trying to be like God? Wouldn't like self-destruction assisted suicide be the opposite of that?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of comments to make there. One, of course, is it's about control. The control of conception and the control of the hour of our death. And the hour of our death, of course, is the thing of which we have least control. So there's a sense in which, if you're going to be God, you've got to grab control of these two things. Transhumanists are doing their best to make sure death is consigned to history as a human phenomenon, never asking the question of what will it be like when we have 10,000 generations of the same family trying to relate to each other. It would not be a good situation. So there's that aspect to it, the godlike power of control. I think there's also, though, a eugenics that lies behind both as well. When you think about the selective abortions to get rid of people with Down syndrome, Iceland is in the vanguard of that. And also the logic of what makes a life worth living. Originally, as I understand it, euthanasia was being promoted for those with terrible terminal diseases for whom the future held nothing but pain and misery. And one can say that's I don't agree with euthanasia in those circumstances, but I could certainly see that, wow, that's an arguable case. I don't agree with it, but I can see somebody making the argument. But now it's become, we're seeing in Europe and even in Canada emerging, young people with depression who are not feeling that happy with life. They too can elect to have this. In Canada,
healthy 25-year-olds.
Yeah. So the bar is being lowered and lowered. And behind that, of course, is a vision of what a life worth living is like. And I would say it's a kind of eugenics. We're saying, to old people, you are not needed anymore. Your oldness, your age renders you a less than viable human being. So you need to be dispatched. So I think there's a eugenic side of it, which again points towards overcoming our God-given limitations in a way that, well, we will be like God.
Carl, it strikes me that one of the other problems with the disenchantment thesis, if that's all you say, is that we're disenchanted, we need to be re-enchanted in some fashion, is that it doesn't specify that re-enchantment needs to be based on truth. When you talk about desecration, that's a very different proposition, because then you have to actually ask the question, what would it look like for us to sacralize, as a re-sacralize and understand the sacredness of human beings, which requires something substantial, requires something truthful. You could potentially propose re-enchantment through any number of, fictional constructs. It wouldn't have to be true.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I think that, one of the advantages of making the problem worse, if you like, by calling it desecration, is it does point us to the answer, which is consecration. And I think you're correct that you could. I've actually had an offline discussion with Rod Dreher about this. Of course, he's a big fan of the disenchantment idea, and his I think he makes a legitimate point that his more radical understanding of disenchantment overlaps with my understanding of desecration. So you can use the disenchantment word in a way that doesn't reduce the problem to an aesthetic, if you like. But I would say the vulnerability of disenchantment is, hey man, if I can just convince myself there are fairies at the bottom of my garden and enchant the world again, part of the problem is solved. I want to say no. Desecration has intentional moral connotations that clearly require, we would say, repentance. And it requires consecration. And where are we consecrated? Well, we're consecrated in the church. It's the church that through its teaching, through its worship, and through the way of life that its people live day by day, demonstrates to the world around what it means to be truly human. If you think of ancient Israel's task, she was to be a light to the nations. Well, a big part of that was ancient Israel was to walk to the beat of God's drum. She was to have a king. She was to have Jehovah as her king. And her cultic life, her doctrinal life, and her commitment to hospitality, these were the things that were to be a sign to the Gentiles that this is what humanity is meant to be. And I think that task now falls to the church.
Yeah, if you ask the question, what would it look like for my life to have enchantment? You can go down all kinds of false trails.
Yeah.
If you ask the question, what would it look like for my life to be consecrated to the Lord, consecrated as I'm created to be, that's a very that takes you down a very different path. That's a very different kind of question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it places a moral demand on us. And one of the things that lies behind the book as a sort of side issue is there's a lot of interest, very welcome interest at the moment among intellectuals, among, we might say, culture makers in Christianity. And one of the points I try to make in the book is, it's not enough to see Christianity as delivering good social and cultural results. You've got to believe that the tomb was empty on the third day.
But this is why Richard Dawkins can sign up for a cultural Christianity and still be an atheist, technically.
Yeah, and I think, of all people, ironically, Nietzsche nails that in the 19th century. He says, you can't have your cake and eat it. If you're going to kill God, boy, you've got to live as if God is dead.
Which means you've got to take over the job.
Yeah. Ivan Karamazov makes the same point in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. Of course, you have to rise to the challenge, and that's an exhilarating challenge. It's also a terrifying challenge. Bottom line is, it's easier not to be God and just to follow the rules, which is what these guys, these sort of polite intellectual atheists want. And I want to make, I'd encourage listeners, don't be cynical about the new intellectual interest in Christianity. See it as an opportunity, but don't allow people to rest comfortable in the benefits of Christianity without the doctrine. I was struck recently, I think it was something Ross Douthat wrote, when, of course, he's writing from a Catholic perspective, but he had an engagement with somebody who'd become a Catholic and loved going to church because the Mass was beautiful. And Douthat was making the point that, okay, the Mass may be beautiful, but do you believe it? It's actually making demands. And I want to say that for Protestant Christianity, it gives us the Book of Common Prayer. It gives us literary English. It gives us the King James Version of the Bible. But is the tomb empty? Have you trusted in Christ and turned from your sins? Are you part of the body of Christ, worshiping him week by week? Those are the big, they're not glamorous things, but they're essential things.
That seems to be, that was sort of the missing thing, maybe even in Tom Holland's Dominion, where he's arguing dispositively the benefits in the West of Christianity are there to see and must be acknowledged, which as a Christian who doesn't get that acknowledgement, you're grateful that someone's saying that. But at the same time, that's just so far down the scale of why we're Christians.
Yeah. Though the encouraging thing is now that a number of these intellectuals who've been making that point go to church. Mary Harrington now, I think, professes to be a Christian. I think Louise Perry might be the same. I don't know about Tom Holland, but I believe he's going to church. And if you go to church week by week, you're hearing the Bible read. Hopefully, you're hearing the word proclaimed. Uh, the Lord attaches promises to those things that we need to pray that the Lord will come through on for these individuals. I'm tremendously encouraged on that front. It's very easy, particularly as a conservative Presbyterian, to be very cynical about any good thing that seems to be happening in the world. But I want to say, no, this is an opportunity for us. Maybe it'll go nowhere, but if it goes nowhere, let it not be because we failed to seize it as an opportunity to engage in discussions with such people.
Carl, I had one small, this is change gears a little bit, but still in your book,
Yeah.
about sort of the ways in which we argue against some of this desecration and transgressiveness. So in particular on transgenderism, for instance, you make an observation, it really struck me, that at the vanguard of opposition to transgenderism is the protection of women's sports, as opposed to women's safety, for instance, in public restrooms. And even though that does get mentioned, the women's sports issue gets so much more press.
Yeah.
And why is that a problematic counterattack to the desecration of transgenderism?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say, I'm surprised that has been the case, but also I rejoice in it. If we get good results legislatively,
Agreed.
as a result, that's a good thing. And I was actually talking to John Stonestreet the other week, and we were talking about this very thing. And I made the point that I think that picture of a diminutive Riley Gaines standing next to the giant Leah Thomas,
it's effective
on the podium. Yeah, that had more effect than any book that I could ever write on the issue, or any book of gender critical theory, because it's unfair. Maybe the one thing that we still share some kind of moral sense on as a society today is fairness, and that just looks obviously unfair. So I think there's it's a political opportunity that we should definitely exploit and use. The problem, of course, is that women's sports. I want to. It's going to sound terribly sexist here, but there's kind of women's sports. They're not exactly the most important cultural thing in the United States of America or in Europe. Much more
because men's sports are.
I didn't say that, James. I'm going to play.
I'm just feeling you out here.
I actually don't think American sports are important at all. I'm thinking of rugby.
That's what I was
here,
setting
really.
you up for that moment.
but the real question, of course, is the status of the body. Are our bodies something we inhabit, or are they an integral part of who we are? And you and I both have a critical love of Thomas Aquinas.
Yes.
And Aquinas makes a wonderful point in his lectures on 1 Corinthians 15 that when you die and your soul is separated from your body, he makes a point that it isn't you. Your soul is not you. It won't be fully you until the day of resurrection.
That's right.
Because you are body and soul. And I think that Christians need to realize that, fairness and safety, even safety, these are, they're important issues in their own way. I would put safety way above fairness. But at the bottom is this issue of what does it mean to be human? What status do our bodies have relative to who we are? And that's a big metaphysical question. And interesting enough, I think it's that kind of question that has driven Mary Harrington into the arms of Christianity, because she wanted some sort of metaphysical way of thinking about the authority of the woman's body as a woman's body, and ultimately found that Christianity was the place where she could ground that idea.
Well, Carl, I wish we could keep talking, but we're out of time. Again, the book is The Desecration of Man, How the Rejection of God Degrades Our Humanity. Thanks for your labors in this book, and thanks for your willingness to come on and talk with us about it for a few minutes.
Thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure to speak to you guys.
James, this is a great book, and I think both of us were facing the same struggle as we interviewed Carl. He's a friend and just such an interesting conversation partner. And there are so many different directions we could go in discussing this book, but I want to just say to our listeners, it is worth reading. It's a little shorter than his Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It doesn't require that you've read that book, but it's some of the insights are based on what he says there. it's really just an outstanding and helpful work, I think.
More anthropology and sociology than history, as in the other book,
Yes.
which I think is sort of a natural next step in this project of his. And the other thing is that this book talks more about technology and the role that it plays in expressive individualism than the previous works. So in that respect, different. I think also it's probably the kind of book, I mean, being published by Sentinel, a division of Penguin, it's the kind of book that I think you can just probably put it even into more hands than the other one and expect that it would actually get read. And it is somewhat of a page turner as you go through it. It's excellent writing, and it's every once in a while, even as I mentioned in my question, just a kind of slightly unexpected turn or critique of sort of how we're approaching the desecration problem, and which is, I think, for those who are familiar with Carl's writing, maybe not surprising, but even still, I found it really chock full of good research and compelling writing.
Well, if you'd like to enter for an opportunity to win a couple of the copies that we have of The Desecration of Man, you can do that at placefortruth.org or at theologyonthego.org. There's a place for you to enter your information, and we do have some copies that we're happy to give away. And if you know someone who might be helped by this episode or other episodes, please pass them along. We love hearing from you, so feel free to give us your suggestions and thoughts. If you're able to rate and review the podcast, that really helps us. So if you could take a minute to do that, we'd appreciate it. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. Both of those web pages have a donate button on the top of the screen. And so, as always, we thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.